we are ready to go back on the record, is that right?
Ready.
Ready, Jim.
All right.
Starting YouTube back up.
All right, thank you, council. We are ready at this time to continue the hearing. And Mr. Ashcraft, you are going to call your next witness.
Yes, Judge, thank you. I call Judge Tracy Green.
Thank you, Judge Green. If you'll come to the witness stand. You may be seated, and then I'm going to swear you in. Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm that your testimony today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. State your name, please.
Tracy Green.
Thank you. And Judge Green, you'll probably have to speak up also a little bit if I can't hear you. So I'm going to start with the sequestration order and the witness protocol order. And a few of these paragraphs do apply, some do not, because we're not on Zoom any longer. Sequestration includes a prohibition on any witness, except while testifying by Zoom during the proceedings, from doing any of the following: discussing her testimony in any format or by any means with another witness, viewing the proceedings on any device, listening to the proceedings on any device, or accessing or viewing any information about the proceedings via any social media or news outlets. Potential witnesses may discuss the pending formal complaint with counsel for the parties and may be shown exhibits by counsel prior to their testimony. A failure to serve the order by any party or a violation of the order by a witness is grounds to exclude a witness or exclude testimony given by that witness prior to discovery of the failure or violation. Do you have any questions regarding the sequestration order, Judge?
No.
Thank you. With respect to the order regarding hearing and witness protocol, no witness shall access or review any documents or other materials beyond the relevant trial exhibits, pleadings, or transcripts, or police reports during their testimony until the trial is over. No witness shall have a document within reach or sight. If a witness needs to refer to a document, she may do so only if invited to by counsel or approved by the master. Witnesses shall certify under oath that no one has given them information by any means to assist in testifying that counsel and the master cannot observe. Do you so certify?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. I think that is it. Then any questions regarding either of those orders?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Ashcraft, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Judge.
Good morning, Inspector.
Let's begin today with you sharing with us a little bit about your background. Specifically, let's start with your family. Tell us about your family.
Well, I am a wife, mother, grandmother of 7. I am a daughter, a sister, and an aunt. And I am the primary caregiver for my elderly mother. And those are the main family members that I have day-to-day access and responsibility. Well, not the grandchildren, but.
How many children and grandchildren do you have?
I have 7 grandchildren. 5 by my eldest son, Gary. 1 by my middle son, Travis, and 1 by my youngest son, Justin.
And what are the ages range with regard to your grandchildren?
Get this right. I've missed a lot of birthdays, so. Let's see. Gary is 13. Russell is 11, going on 12. Daisy is 10. Daniel should be 7. And Kaylin should be 5. Ziggy is 2. He will be 3 next week. In 2 weeks. And Julian is 2.
Those are your grandchildren. How many children do you have?
5. Well, between my husband Andre and I, we have 5 children. We're a blended family.
When you say a blended family, what do you mean?
I mean that we both came into our marriage with our own children, our biological children, and we helped each other raise them.
And how long have you been married?
It will be 16 years next month on the 16th.
Let's talk a little bit about your background in terms of your church.
Well, I've been a member of Greater Christ Baptist Church. It's located in Detroit, Michigan. I've been a very active member there for various 33, so about 28 years. I'm active in the music ministry. I sing in choir, and I participate in various activities that may come up from time to time around the church. It's a big part of my life. I spend quite a bit of time in and out of that church.
And have you raised your family in church?
Yes, that's it.
What about your grandkids?
Well, to the extent that my grandchildren participated in church, I was the primary person who would ensure that occurred. Especially with Gary's children, well, specifically with Gary's children, because Ziggy and Julian are still being and they have spent a lot of time.
And you're a sitting judge, yes, and a lawyer.
Yes.
Before you became a lawyer, did you work outside the home?
Before I became a lawyer, yes, I did.
What did you do?
I was a foster care caseworker. I first worked at the Children's Center, Wayne County, for maybe just over a year, maybe 15 months. And then I worked for what was then the Family Independence Agency. It's the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and the Child and Family Services Division. It's changed its name a few times over the years, and right now it's Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And I worked there for about 6 years. Well, 5 years. So I was foster care caseworker for about 6 years altogether.
You say foster care caseworker. What were your responsibilities in that position?
I would develop service plans for parents or other caregivers who had lost temporarily the parental responsibility or placement of their children. And I would testify in court about the progress that those parents were making in their service plans, all in the aim of reuniting the children with their families. Sometimes I would file petitions to terminate parental rights under extreme circumstances. And I wrote a lot of reports. I had to visit the children who were placed on my caseload from time to time. I needed to do it at least once a month. So I made home calls and attended trainings. That's pretty much the bulk of my work as a foster care caseworker.
You eventually went to school, yes?
Yes.
Tell us about that, please.
Well, I began law school while I was still a foster care caseworker, and I always intended to go to law school. But I chose social work as my undergraduate degree because I knew that I would need to work while I was in law school, and I knew that that was a degree that would allow me to be gainfully employed while I was in school.
Where did you go to undergraduate?
Wayne State University.
And how long did it take you to get your degree?
It took me 6 years. By that time, I was already a parent and married and trying to raise a family. So it took me 6 years, and it took me 5 years to get out of law school,
Where did you go to law school?
Wayne State.
And did law school follow on the heels of completing your undergraduate education?
Yes. Yes, pretty much immediately.
And you were sworn in with the State Bar of Michigan in what year?
1997.
And you have been a member of the State Bar of Michigan uninterrupted since that time?
That's
You have a professional resume, is that correct?
yes.
Judge, if I may approach just to give Judge Green a copy of this,
Certainly.
which I'm going to propose an offer as an exhibit. Disciplinary counsel has the copy, so thank you. May I approach?
You may.
Thank you. Judge Green, I've handed you a copy of your professional resume, is that correct?
Yes.
If you would please look at that and confirm for us that it is accurate.
Yes.
Thank you. Your Honor, I move to admit the professional resume of Judge Green as Exhibit 44.
Actually, I think the exhibit list says 51, exhibit 51, but I have no objection to the admission of the resume.
I think there was a gap in numbering, but we can clarify that later. Make sure we provide the information to Ms. Jorgens, and I think we'll be okay.
All right, thank you. It is admitted.
Thank you, Judge. Judge Green, this lays out exhibit number 44, or whatever exhibit we're going to actually number this. This lays out your professional experience, beginning at the top with your appointment to the Third Circuit Court in the state of Michigan, correct?
Yes.
And that was January 1st of 2019.
Yes.
Prior to that time, it lists your work as an attorney at law, a number of different firms or organizations, correct?
Yes.
If you would please just review for me and share with us some specifics with regard to the work that you did as the legal director of Detroit Center for Family Advocacy.
Well, the Detroit Center for Family Advocacy was a legal services program under the auspices of the University of Michigan's Law School, specifically in the Child Advocacy Law Clinic. And it was based in Detroit. There were 2 offices, a main office and a satellite office. And as far as my role as the legal director, I developed the protocols for office practices. I mentored and supervised a group of very young and energetic attorneys. Some of them were volunteers. Some of them were students with us initially and continued with us after they passed the bar. And I kept a small caseload myself as well. I worked very closely with the Department of Health and Human Services because our mission as an organization was to reduce the number of children who were unnecessarily in foster care, recognizing that there is a need for foster care, certainly, but that many children were in foster care needlessly. So we were what I would refer to as a general niche practice, even though I know that sounds a little oxy, because we would do pretty much anything as long as the legal advocacy would remove a barrier that CPS or foster care had identified as requiring a barrier that would either keep the children in foster care longer than necessary or place the children in foster care. So things like landlord, tenant, warrants, custody, a whole host of legal matters that tend to crop up in low-income households. All of our clients had to meet certain income requirements with very few exceptions. And these are the collateral matters that impact child welfare proceedings. Occasionally, we, and that would include myself, would also represent the caregiver in juvenile proceedings to advocate for a particular outcome that typically CPS was seeking.
Your CV indicates that while you were with the center for those 5 years, that you trained professionals locally and nationally on child welfare issues. Tell us about that.
I was actually with the center for 7 years. For the entire time of its existence, it was supposed to be a 3-year pilot project, but it was deemed so helpful in the child welfare space that we continued for another 4 years and were able to get funding here and there. And I trained other attorneys, both parents' attorneys and lawyers guarding ad litem. Sometimes the assistant attorney general would come to the trainings as well. Those assistants attorney general are the representatives of the state. In other counties, the prosecuting attorney promotes a child welfare case, but in Wayne County, which was the jurisdiction for our program, in Wayne County, the assistant attorney general represents the state. So sometimes the assistant attorney general as well. And I trained all over the country. I found myself in North Dakota once, 100 miles away from where my training site was. To convince someone to get me there.
Judge, your CV reflects that all of the work that you've done, both from an occupation perspective before you became a lawyer and since the time you became a lawyer, and before you became a judge, related somehow to families and children. Is that right?
Yes. Well, primarily. Certainly while I was at Detroit Center for Family Advocacy, it was exclusively with children and families. Are you referring to just that time period?
Yes. Your CV also indicates on the second page that you received a particular award. Could you tell us about that, please?
Yes. It was conferred by the Foster Care Review Board, which is a program of the Michigan Supreme Court. And I received the first Parents Attorney of the Year award. And prior to that award, the Foster Care Review Board would recognize foster parents, lawyers guardian ad litem, and assistants attorney general or prosecuting attorneys, as the case may be, depending on the county awardee. But in that year, they decided to create a new award, and I was very pleased to receive it.
What was the name of that award again?
It was the Parents Attorney of the Year.
Thank you.
Your CV also indicates that you have published articles specifically in the area of child welfare. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'd like to move on, Judge Green, and ask you if you would please tell us about your relationship with your son, Gary.
Well, Gary's my eldest son. He's 33 years old. And I wouldn't describe our relationship as particularly close, but there's a lot of love between us. He married very early on. He eloped actually with Corey Bressler at 18. It was a week before he was scheduled to begin Morehouse College. And he was preparing to leave. Well, we were preparing for it to leave. But he ran into Corey over the summer prior to his time to go to school, and they eloped. And he knew that it was a decision that I thought was a very poor decision for a number of reasons, not the least of which was that they were both so young. They were 18 and 19 years old. And Corey wasn't a stranger to our family. We didn't know her well, but I'd seen her throughout the years since she was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, because her grandmother, who was a member of our church, would bring her to church periodically. So all of the children at the church knew one another and engaged with one another. So Gary met her and had pretty much known her his entire life. She went into foster care at some point and went from family member to family member and eventually out of state. So when she returned after graduating from high school back to Michigan, he ran into her at one of the local festivals, and they had what I would describe a whirlwind romance of about 2 months. And we didn't even know that they were dating. And I think that he purposefully kept that from us because he thought that, and he was certainly right, that I wouldn't approve.
And when they got married, did you maintain a relationship with them?
I did maintain a relationship with them. And at some point, Gary and Corey, I don't remember if she was still pregnant or if Gary Jr. was a newborn, but at some point they had to come and live with us because they had lost their housing. They were kids. They were very irresponsible. They weren't ready for adult activity and adult responsibility.
You mentioned pregnant.
Yes.
How soon after they married did that happen?
Well, I know it happened 5 months after they married because when Gary and Corey came to us and announced that they were getting married the next day, which was the week before he was to go to Morehouse, they told us that they weren't going to have any children for 5 years. And I think that was to reassure us that we know this looks like a very bad move, but we've got it under control. 5 months later, she was pregnant.
And Gary Jr. was their first child? And did Russell follow?
Yes, very soon after. Gary and Russell are not even 2 years apart.
Did you maintain a relationship with the now larger family when the boys came along?
Yes, well, very, very briefly, as I was saying, when Gary was an infant, they came to live with us because they lost their housing. I think that they were evicted. And we purchased our current home with the belief that we would probably have to be a backup plan for them for quite some time because they were very young. So they came to live with us. It was a very tumultuous time. And at one point, we had to get the assistance of the police to have them leave because Corey had attacked us in our home.
At this point, was it just Gary Sr., Corey, and Gary Jr.? Or was
Yes,
it? Okay. And so the three of them moved in with you and your husband, Andre?
well, I can't remember if Corey was still pregnant when they moved in, but Gary, it was just the three of them who lived there briefly. I would say maybe 3 or 4 months.
So you had an opportunity then to observe them within your home as well as outside your home?
Yes, and I want to correct my last statement. It wasn't 3 or 4 months. It was under a month that they actually lived with us. I recall.
Tell us about your observations of their relationship as a family.
They argued all the time. Almost, it just seemed, it was just incessant. They argued all the time. It didn't seem to bother them, but it made everyone else uncomfortable. So we were always on eggshells. We weren't, and by we, I mean the rest of the family, and especially Andre. We weren't so much concerned about our activities as Gary and Corey would perceive them. We were always concerned about how Corey might perceive something that we decided, because it was like walking on eggshells. We just never knew. Corey was very troubled.
Tell us about your relationship with Corey.
I can completely understand why Gary fell in love with Corey. Corey is smart. She can be very sweet. She can even be nurturing, and she's fun to be around when she's not. She has ongoing issues that I don't believe have ever been addressed. And so we would engage with her, and we loved Corey. But we never really knew how far we could go with her because we were afraid that she would erupt. I made a comment once about something that she was wearing. I was trying to be helpful. I was trying to mother her. I knew she didn't have a good relationship with her mother. And she seemed very open to that. And so I tried to advise her on what I thought would be appropriate dress for a particular occasion. And I found that she locked herself in the bathroom for over an hour. And we didn't know what to do. Having her in our family presented challenges for us that we'd never encountered before.
You indicated that Gary Sr. and Corey argued a lot. Are you aware of Gary Sr. ever being physically violent with Corey?
And as a matter of fact, after they married. A week after they married, Gary returned home with a black eye. And we thought that was an opportunity to tell him, well, we advised you that this wasn't something you should do. We thought he would stay, but he didn't. He returned. And this was before she was pregnant. So I think Gary was determined to show us that he could take on all of this responsibility, not just marriage, but in dealing with a spouse who he knew had some challenges. And he didn't want any help from us. He didn't want the scrutiny. He would only allow us to have a view into what he was doing on his terms.
Did the relationship between Gary Sr. and Corey eventually sour?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, I don't know what the final straw was, but he met and became involved in a relationship with Daisy's mother.
What's her
And
name?
China.
Go ahead.
And
What was that last name?
her first name is China, last name is Gray.
Thank you.
And he left. He left the family home and moved in with China. And he and China had Daisy together. And Corey was distraught. I went to see her one day, and she was in what I could only describe as a full-blown mental breakdown. The house was an absolute disaster. I mean, there was trash all over the floor. I can't even begin to describe what I saw when I came in. And I knew that they weren't living that way the entire time that they were there. I just assumed that because of the state that I found her in when I arrived, that she trashed the house. So I convinced her, and it took some convincing, but she did eventually agree that I should take her to the hospital. And I did, and the boys were with her. So Gary Sr. got the boys. I don't know if he came to get them or if I took them to him while Corey was in the hospital. And she was there for about a week. And after that, I believe that the boys, I think that that's when the boys started living with Gary and China full time. But when Corey was released from the hospital, she went to her grandmother's house. Her mother was living there at the time as well. They have a very tumultuous relationship. She and her mother contacted me and told me, I just can't stay here. And Andre and I knew that we knew that if she was going to be stable, she needed to be in a home where she had support and where there wasn't any drama. So she didn't ask, but we did offer for her to come and stay with us. And she did. She came and lived with us for 6 months.
Corey and the boys?
No, the boys were living with Gary in China at this time.
When Gary was with China, was he still married to Corey?
Yes, he was.
And you indicated that China became pregnant. Did that occur also when he was still married to Corey?
Yes. And when Corey was living with us, we didn't allow Gary or China to come and visit at all. So they didn't, if we saw them, we went to them because Corey wanted to reconcile. And we knew that if China and Gary came to the home, that would excite her. And we just wanted to the extent that we could, just keep tranquility in our home. And for the most part, for the 6 months, we didn't have any problems with her at all. But towards the end of the 6 month period, we learned that she was stalking China and Gary, and then she was going from their places of employment to our pastor's house looking for Gary. She took our car with permission. She said that she was going to go out with some friends, but she wound up at Gary and China's house, banging on the door in the middle of the night. And with that particular incident, we said, we just can't do this anymore. And so she found a place on her own, and she did leave, and we left on good terms, so we thought.
Did you have occasion to observe Gary Sr. and China's relationship?
No. And I preferred it that way because Gary was still married to Corey, and Corey wanted to reconcile. And the idea, I just tried to put myself in her shoes. If my husband were coming to my home, because although it was Andre's and my house, but it was her home, she was living there. The whole reason we had her there was so that she could develop some mental stability. We knew that if Gary and China were coming around, that was just going to just completely derail any plans that we had to help her get on her feet. So we didn't see them much at all. I think during that period, I may have seen Daisy a handful of times for about 6 months.
And Daisy, that's Gary Sr. and China's daughter.
Yes.
And did the relationship, did Gary Sr. ever marry China?
No.
Did the relationship eventually end?
Yes.
So,
well, China, I think, got tired of waiting for Gary to divorce Corey. Gary's he's a very religious person. And by religious, I mean very regimented. He was determined that he was not going to divorce. He had a very strong opposition to divorce. I didn't know how he could reconcile not wanting to divorce, but living with China and then having a baby with China while he was married, but that was another poor choice. He decided that that's what he was going to do. And so, I'm sorry.
so I just want to, after that relationship ended with China, did he start a new one with someone else?
Eventually, so China left because Gary had filed at first for custody of the boys, and then he didn't get court served, so he filed for divorce. But it was it was the day after China left, and so after that, he and China were no longer a couple, but eventually they became really good co-parents, and even to the extent that China allowed Gary and his partner to rent space above her house. She has a second floor that she doesn't use as an office.
Did he eventually establish a relationship with another woman?
Yes.
With whom?
Katie.
Katie?
Yes.
And when was that approximately?
That would have been, I'm not sure when they began the relationship, because I learned much later that she was pregnant when we met her. We met her in maybe the late fall, early winter of 2000, 14. And, but I know that they were in a relationship before that. I'm just not sure for how long.
And did Gary and Katie also have a child?
Yes, they have 2 children, Daniel and Kaylin.
What are those names?
Daniel and Kaylin,
Spelled Kaylin.
Kaylin.
Thank you. Continue.
Thank you, Judge. And when did he marry Katie eventually?
Excuse me. Yes,
Were you still maintaining contact with Corey during this time period when Gary was with Katie?
no. After, I think it was, I'm not certain when Gary and Katie began dating, because I had no view into that at all. But after Gary and China broke up, I don't remember Gary being single for long, maybe 3 to 6 months or so before he met Katie. And we didn't have much contact with them until Daniel was back.
How were the boys being handled in terms of were they spending time with Gary and Katie, or with Corey, or both?
Well, as far as I could tell, they were going back and forth, but it was very irregular. And at some point, Corey began withholding the boys from Gary, which meant that she was withholding them from us because we had determined that we were only going to have contact with Gary and Russell when they were with their father, because we just didn't want to have to deal with Corey if we didn't have to. And so I don't really know what the arrangement was, but I know that it was irregular, whether they kept to, whether they had an arrangement that was something that was regular. It wasn't something that they kept, because I knew that Gary wasn't seeing them all.
In this time period, did your relationship with Corey deteriorate?
It did, but I didn't have a lot of interaction with her. And I say that it did deteriorate because she would keep the boys away from us too. If she needed a babysitter, she would contact us, and she knew we wouldn't deny an opportunity, and she knew we wouldn't pass up an opportunity to see our grandchildren. But sometimes I would reach out to her in the beginning, and then what I mean by in the beginning is during the period where Gary was no longer living with China and before they divorced. I would reach out initially, first maybe a month or two, and try to have contact with the boys. And most of the time she wouldn't allow it. Sometimes she would allow it, or she would say she was going to allow it, and then she didn't allow it. And she would use the boys to manipulate me into doing or saying certain things to Gary. And it always, what my ability to have contact, meaningful contact with Gary Jr. and Russell was somehow tied up in whether she was upset with Gary in any particular moment.
Did there come a time when you had to pursue a personal protection order as to Corey?
Yes.
Tell us about that, please.
Gary and Corey were in divorce proceedings. Now, the actual divorce custody proceedings were filed this time by court. And during that time, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I lost my train of thought.
Yes. Did there come a time where your relationship with Corey deteriorated and you needed to pursue a personal protection order?
So, So, again, we were happy to just leave Corey be. We didn't contact her. At this time, I had stopped calling her to ask her to see the boys. Andre and I decided at some point they're going to be divorced. We know that they are because the case is pending. Service has been perfected. It's moving along. And so we thought, whatever happens, we're going to have contact with our grandchildren regularly because Gary is going to have some kind of parenting time, whether he gets custody or not. So we didn't engage her at all, but she would contact me. She would call me and harass me, leave nasty messages on my voicemail. She would show up unannounced and uninvited at my house. Once she even came in my yard when Andre and I were on our back deck, and she wasn't invited to do that. I asked her to leave, and she would not leave. So I knew we were going on vacation. I wasn't comfortable leaving on vacation without a personal protection order because I believed that she would trash my house. And at some point, and it wasn't when we came back from vacation, but at some point we did find that our cars had been keyed. Someone had taken something and scraped all the way around my husband's vehicle.
Did you actually secure what everybody refers to as a PPO against Corey?
Yes.
And do you remember when that was?
It was, it should have been in August of, I know let's see, the divorce was filed in 14, but they weren't divorced until June of 15. So it would have been sometime in between there. I'm sorry, I think it was maybe August of 14.
I think that we've actually stipulated that the date that you secured the PPO was August 1st of 2014. Does that sound correct?
Yes. We always take our vacation about the same time. I just wasn't sure. Yes, that's not.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned that Corey had filed for divorce against Gary Sr. Did the divorce ultimately go through?
Yes.
And was it a smooth divorce, for want of a better word, or was it a complicated divorce as relates to the boys?
It was like World War III, frankly. It really was. It was just a nightmare. And Andre and I were still maintaining our position. We're going to stay out of it. We're going to have some grandparenting time because we know Gary's going to get something. And after the first day of trial, we got a call from Gary's lawyer telling us that, describing to us what happened in court that day. And we wound up having to go to court and testify about the reason that Corey was living with us for those 6 months, because she said it was something else.
And did you actually then testify at the custody hearing?
Yes, I did. We both did.
I didn't hear what you said.
We both did. Andre and I both did.
Thank you. Now, prior to the time that the divorce was filed and you testified at the custody proceeding, were you aware of Gary or Corey's use of corporal punishment on the boys?
Not at the time of the proceeding, of the custody proceeding. I learned after the custody proceeding.
Explain what you mean by that, please.
Well, when I was testifying, I could glean what might have transpired prior to my testimony, but I knew for certain after the case was over, because there was a part of the conditions of parenting time was that neither of them could use corporal punishment. And I read Judge Cox's opinion, and I know that he determined that they both had used corporal punishment.
And as part of the custody decision, did you say that there was an order entered with regard to corporal punishment?
Yes, as part of the custody decision, he ordered that neither of them could use corporal punishment during their time with the children.
At this time, Judge Green, had you ever seen marks on the bodies of the boys?
No.
Including even red marks on their face, for example?
Not before, are we talking about during the?
This is the time of the custody hearing and the results of the custody hearing. Had you seen any marks on the bodies of the boys?
No.
Even, for example, a red mark on a face?
No.
You did testify at the custody trial, but I want to make sure I understand in what context. Did you testify as a fact witness or some sort of an expert witness?
I testified as a fact witness, but my testimony included things that I knew about how CPS investigations are scored, the structured decision-making that allows the investigator to determine whether there's been abuse or neglect, and if so, at what level, which dictates whether they file a petition. So I testified about that.
And when you testified about that, were you doing that based upon your expertise in the area of child welfare?
No, I was really primarily relying on my knowledge since I was a foster care worker. I mean, the policies of DHHS they've changed over time. They're updated from time to time, but they're generally the same throughout the years. So there had been, during the custody proceeding, there had been a CPS investigation against Corey for giving Gary Jr. a black eye. And it was over a scissors incident. Apparently he'd broken a pair of scissors. And the investigation, however, was scored in such a way that no petition was filed. Or, and at the very least, no substantiation of abuse or neglect was determined. But if it had been scored properly, they would have had to do one of either of those things: substantiate that there was a abuse or neglect at a level 2, which is the level right before petition, or file a petition.
What Gary was awarded sole custody of the boys, is that correct?
He was awarded sole legal custody and primary physical custody.
When you say primary physical custody, what did that mean as relates to whether the children, your grandsons, were shared between Gary Sr. and their mother, Corey?
Well, initially, and by initially I mean within maybe a month of the divorce, the parenting time order was for Corey to have parenting time. I mean, it was every other weekend. But something happened at one of the visits, and Gary, one of the boys' visits with court, and Gary Sr. went back to court and requested a change in the parenting time. And he received that, and Corey was ordered to have supervised parenting time at GrowthWorks.
At GrowthWorks, you said?
Yes.
So this is 2015. Are the boys then now living full-time with Gary Sr. and Katie?
Yes.
And tell us, if you would, during this time period or at this time juncture, were you involved more in the lives of the family?
Yes, I was able to see the boys a lot.
You say a lot more. What does that mean?
Maybe at least 1 or 2 times a week.
And how were you spending time with them?
Well, we spend most of our time at our house, and they really enjoyed being there because they would always ask if they could stay longer, so I know that they did. We played games, we watched movies, we ate junk food. They spent a good amount of time with Simone. They thought it was cool that they had an aunt who was still a kid. And we traveled together. We went to see a point a lot. I admit that was my choice. I'm a roller coaster enthusiast.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. You are a,
Roller coaster enthusiast.
thank you. Continue.
And we went to Kalahari Resort. We went to Wheels Inn. We went to, you know, when Disney and other pop culture characters would come to town, have stage productions or on ice, we take them there, take them to the circus, the beach, stage plays. We took them a lot to, I think we took them to just about every performance that Simone had. Simone was in Mosaic Youth Theater.
Did your time with the family also include time at church?
Oh, yes.
Did you participate specifically in the lives of Gary Jr. and Russell as relates to church? How so?
Well, I was their primary mode of transportation. And I'm confident that if I hadn't persisted and just got Gary Senior to the point where he just wanted me to leave him alone about it, that they wouldn't have been going to church regularly. So I took them on Mondays for choir rehearsal and for youth fellowship. Sometimes I would just stay in the parking lot and wait for them because it's just a 2-hour period. Sometimes I would come back and get them. But I would drive them and bring them home. Either drive them or bring them home or do both. But I was always somehow involved in their transportation, and we spent a lot of time talking during those trips. And
Just to connect the dots here, as relates to their time at church, you heard the testimony of Ms. Edwards and Mr. Holmes in this case, yes?
yes,
Those were the people that worked with the kids specifically at church and those different ministries, is that right?
with others, yes.
With others, meaning other church staff people.
Yes,
I
well,
understand.
not staff, everyone. Well, I believe Mr. Holmes is a paid employee, but everyone else was volunteer.
Now, you described a number of situations where the kids would, I would suspect, have on different kinds of clothing, meaning long sleeves and long pants, and also occasions where they would be in short sleeves and short pants. Is that right?
Absolutely. They
During,
were always appropriately dressed, so, you know, in the summer or whenever it was warm outside, they would wear short sleeves or no sleeves. They might even wear tank tops. They'd wear shorts.
at any time when you were spending time with the boys during these activities and around this time, did you ever observe any marks on the bodies of the boys in any respect?
No,
Were you aware at any time after after 2015, whether Gary or Katie were using corporal punishment on the boys?
after 2015.
After 2015, yes.
Well, I learned that they were after the CPS investigation began.
You're talking now, we're moving forward to 2018.
Yes,
Were you aware prior to 2018, when CPS intervened in that family unit, whether or not Gary Sr. was using corporal punishment to discipline the boys?
no,
After custody was awarded to Gary Sr. in 2015, did Corey stay involved in the parenting?
no.
If you would please tell us about that.
Corey completely abandoned the boys, and they were devastated by it. I really saw my role as, because I'm their grandmother, so I knew I would be in their life all of their lives. I saw my role as someone who could not make up for the fact that their mother wasn't around, but I could fill some of the gaps, being nurturing and just spending time and listening to them and showing them in any way that I could think that I love them and was concerned about them.
Did you observe in the boys any reaction to the fact that their mom had abandoned them?
Yes.
What did you observe?
Well, when we drive back and forth to church for the Monday night activities, at one point I noticed that Russell would begin to cry. And it was always that he would begin to cry at a certain point in the trip. Then I realized that it was because we were driving past the exit that they remembered it was used to go home when they lived with their mother. And I talked to Russell about that. And I asked him if he would feel better if I changed the route. He told me, yes, I changed the route. So I had to go an indirect way to church so that he wouldn't become emotional. Gary Jr. would just become very sullen.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
He would just become very sullen. And they both would sit in the back seat, which I thought was a good orientation towards them because they didn't have to look me in the eye and I could just speak to them and just try to encourage them. And Russell would ask, does mommy still love us? As she replaced us, because we attend the same church as his mother's family. So they knew that his mother had 2 additional children whom they hadn't met. And, well, I think 1 additional child at that point. And they weren't seeing her. They knew that they could see her at GrowthWorks, but that never happened. And so they were just always pining for their mother. And we talked about this just about every single time that I would see them. And it got to the point where not Russell, but Gary would complain about Katie. And the way the dynamic between them was that Gary was more quiet, more thoughtful. He's the leader. Russell would defer to Gary. So if Gary was talking, Russell would stand in agreement. If he disagreed with something that Gary was saying, he would interject. But if he didn't disagree, he would just say nothing. And Gary had begun at some point to complain about how mean Katie was. And this was a big change because prior to the time that he began making these complaints, they loved Katie. They would say very favorable things about Katie. And so it was this constant, Katie's mean, Katie's mean. And so I asked, well, why do you say that Katie's mean? And they would give me, Gary would give me reasons that I really didn't think were mean. Like she won't let us watch TV in the bed with her, with the babies, or she won't let us play with the iPads while, but she'll let the babies do it, or something like that. And I assumed that it was because they were missing their mother. It had been a very long time. They were rejecting the efforts that Katie was making to be their mother. And I'd seen this before, just in my work life. So on a particular occasion, the criticism of Katie was just so strong coming from Gary. I took him into my room and I sat on the bed. I pulled him in front of me so that he could be eye level or a little higher than me. And I asked him, what is really going on here? And I didn't allow Russell in. I closed the door, and I learned that he really just missed his mother. And he cried. He cried for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I just held him.
After 2015, were you aware of how Gary Sr. would discipline the boys?
After 2015?
Yes, after 2015, when he gained complete custody of them.
Yes, I was aware. I witnessed him disciplining the boys. At that time, they were living on Rosemont, and it wasn't far from my house, so I would drop in fairly regularly, maybe for just 5 minutes here and there. And I would witness that they were either not able to watch TV or not able to use their iPads. They both had iPads that their godmother had given them for a gift at some point. And once they moved over to Manor and they were a little older, they weren't just having those privileges removed, they were required to remain in their room. And I didn't think that there was anything wrong with these tactics specifically, but I thought that they would be disciplined for things that I wouldn't have disciplined them for. And maybe that was just the grandmother in me, because I did get from time to time Gary saying, well, if it had been me, you would have been, you would have been outraged. You would have, now you think this isn't a big deal. He said that a couple of times, but I never had any reason at all to even suspect that he was using corporal punishment. See, you have to understand what Gary went through to get custody of those boys. And I witnessed this, and I experienced it to a great degree because, again, his ability to have access to children is my ability to have access to children. So,
Did you address the concerns or his discipline style with him?
I didn't tell him I think you shouldn't be doing this, but I would question him from time to time. Why is that such a big deal? Or do you really think that it's necessary? Can't he come? We might have, a date. I might have had a date planned with them, a movie date or something, and only Russell might come out of the house or only Gary. Well, can't he come anyway, and then he resume his punishment later? It was those kinds of interventions, but never anything too strong, because he wasn't doing anything wrong per se. But I never had any reason at all to suspect that he was doing anything different than what I was seeing, especially because I knew that he knew that there was a court order preventing him from using corporal punishment.
Did you eventually observe a mark on the bodies of one of the boys?
Yes,
Who?
Gary Jr.
Tell us what you observed. Well, first, let's start with this. Can you give us a time period when you observed this?
Well, I'm basing my memory on how tall Gary was in orientation to me. So I don't remember specifically, but I think that it might have been maybe a year or a year and a half before June of 2018 when you were removed. So he may have been 8.5, 9.
And tell us what you saw.
He may have even been 10 too, because his birthday's late in the year. But I saw a faint, what looked like to me, outline of some fingers. Not the whole hand, but at least 3 fingers. And I saw it because I have a 2nd-story bathroom that I would practice applying makeup in. I would keep the door open. One day, Gary and Russell came upstairs, and Gary came into the bathroom, but Russell remained in the hallway. And I don't remember if he showed it to me or if I noticed it on my own. I must have picked him up that day because I remember that it was a school night. But I don't remember where we were coming from. Because I don't remember if it was a Monday, or if it was a Monday, we would have been coming from choir rehearsal.
Let me interrupt you here just so we know what you observed. You said you saw a red outline of fingers. Can you point to us and in so doing describe, so the record is clear, where you saw the red mark on Gary Jr.'s cheek?
Judge, I object to the question. I think he mischaracterized her testimony. She testified that it was a faint outline of fingers.
Okay, I'm happy to re-ask my question. Would you please describe by showing us on your own cheek and describing as you're doing it where you saw the faint outline on Gary Jr.?
Well, I'm pretty sure it was on his right cheek. And it would have been maybe here.
Describe for us where you're showing.
In the apple of my cheek.
In the apple of your cheek?
Right under the cheekbone. So,
Did you say the right or the left?
well, it would have, is this my? Oh. It would have been Gary's left. Yes, it would have been Gary's left. So right here.
Okay, thank you. And specifically, you said an outline, a faint outline. Describe for us in detail what you observed.
Well, it was, as I said, it was faint. Well, Gary described it. It was pinkish. That's true. I don't even know if I would have noticed it if he and I weren't having a one-on-one. Typically, when I would pick up the boys, especially on Mondays, I would wait in the car, and they would get in the car and get in the back seat, and we'd have idle banter, and we'd go wherever we would go. So I remember initially thinking, well, where did that come from? Because he had been with me for a while, and I hadn't even noticed it. And in retrospect, I think that that's why he came to me, because he wanted me to notice. And so we began to talk about it, and Russell was in the hallway Russell was in the hallway. The light wasn't on, but I could see him clearly. He was standing there. His head was bowed, which is what Russell would do when he was in trouble. And what I mean by trouble is when he knew that he had done something wrong at my home that he might be addressed about. He and Gary had gotten to the point, I described how Gary was the leader initially, but as Russell got a little older, he began to challenge Gary a little bit, and they would bicker. And Gary and Russell would bicker about all manner of things, and they would tease each other. It seemed like almost incessant teasing, but it hadn't always been that way. It was only within, I would say the last year and a half or so that this was going on. And by the last year and a half, I mean before they moved. So I learned that I learned that Russell had teased Gary about the handwritten. I immediately.
Before you go on, let me ask a point of clarification here. Was it a pink handprint, or was it a bruise?
It was not a bruise.
Can you tell the difference between, okay, and is this something that you've observed over the course of your life in your own personal life, the difference between something like that?
Yes, and I've observed the differences with children.
In your occupational work before you were a lawyer?
That and my personal life, and even being a child, I remember bruises. I know what a bruise is.
If you would please continue with regard to what you did.
While Gary was still in the bathroom, I went for my phone and I called his dad. Because I learned from Gary that his dad had slapped him. Called his dad. He assured me that it was an isolated incident. He agreed that he was very angry when he did it, but he didn't apologize. He was resolute because Gary Jr. had balled his fist up at Katie. But certainly that wasn't a good choice for discipline.
Did you consider what you observed that day on Gary's cheek to be a sign of physical child abuse?
No.
Why not?
Well, there are a number of reasons. The first is just my own personal view of it. I didn't think it was child abuse. I knew how it got there. It wasn't something that I would have chosen to do myself in terms of discipline. But it is lawful in Michigan to physically discipline your children. I was also very aware of what the child abuse standard is, not just the law, but the practice across the state and especially in Wayne County. Every time that I can ever recall that I've seen a case, handled a case, had information regarding a case of child abuse or neglect that's being investigated, the child has been slapped. Even if a bruise or a mark or something is left, that's not considered child abuse. They will give the parent some parenting support, advise, as the police, I believe, did in this case, that there's a thin line between abuse and neglect, and warn the parent that you really take big risks in using physical discipline. But Gary knew, and by Gary I mean Gary Sr., he knew that I knew that he wasn't even supposed to be using physical discipline. So when I had the conversation with him, and it was a fairly heated discussion, and Gary Jr. was right there to hear it. I wanted Gary Jr. to hear it. I was completely convinced that it would never happen again, and that nothing else had happened prior to that. Because again, I have a lot of access to these children at this point. I would see them in all kinds of contexts. And I never had any reason, especially because I observed discipline, and that wasn't physical. And I would add that I would come to the home and see the boys being disciplined, being confined to their room, for instance, and they had no idea I was coming. So I knew that this wasn't just something performative for me.
Who is the they you're talking about? They had no idea you were coming?
My mother downstairs. I visit my mother, and then I would visit my mother and then go upstairs. So my mother and Gary, Senior, my son, and Katie, and the children, they wouldn't know. It was very rare, actually, that they knew when I was there.
You said something about upstairs, just so I've not heard that before. So just so we can, if you would clarify what you mean by that. You come to visit your mother downstairs, but then you would see the family upstairs, is that right?
Excuse me. Yes. It's an income bungalow. So there's a small apartment upstairs. It's fully self-contained. And then the larger unit downstairs. And my parents, when I grew up in that home, when I was younger, my parents had a tenant who was there for 20 years. And my sister lived there before that. My sister is a lot older.
Now, after you called Gary and let him know how you felt about what you saw, what did you do as relates to Gary Jr.?
I took some liquid foundation and dotted it around the outline
On his cheek?
on his cheek. Russell was still in the hallway. And I didn't tell Russell to go away, even though I knew that that was a source of awkwardness for Gary Jr., because I wanted Russell to understand this is not something that Gary Jr. should be teased about. This is something that Gary Jr. should be shown compassion about. And, you know, if I hadn't already been in the bathroom with the makeup out, I don't even know if that would have been a choice that I would have made. But in that moment, all I wanted to do was reassure a child who I think was not just hurt physically, but hurt emotionally. I think that he was humiliated. I just wanted to make him feel better. I mean, much like when he and his brother and my other grandchildren, or even my children were younger. If they fell, even if they weren't hurt physically, they wanted me to give them a Band-Aid. And I would give them a Band-Aid because that made them feel better. And it was my intention to make Gary Jr. feel better.
Describe, if you would, for us, the type of makeup specifically. Was it liquid? Was it dry? How'd you put it on?
It wasn't a concealer. If it were a concealer, I might have actually been successful in covering it up. But it was liquid makeup. It's not opaque. There are different formula for foundation, and they range from light to heavy coverage. So it was the light coverage type, but it was liquid. It had not a spray mechanism, but a push mechanism to come out.
I'm sorry, a push mechanism?
So kind of like this Purell, but not the same kind. Pump is the word that I'm looking for. It had a pump that you push to.
It wasn't in a, sorry.
A pump to get the foundation.
I see. It wasn't in a compact?
No.
You didn't apply it with a brush?
No, I don't. I have compacts, but they are eyeshadow. They're different. They're palettes. They have different colors. The makeup, the foundation that I used on Gary Jr.'s cheek was brown. You try to get it as close to your complexion as you can. Gary Jr. is quite a bit fairer than I am. So when I put it on, not only did it not cover, but you could tell that it was on. Even though I tried to blend it in to the best of my ability, because it wasn't even the color of his complexion.
But let me ask you a very direct question, Judge Green. Why would you have thought it was okay to do this?
I guess the reality is that I wasn't thinking at the time. At the time, all I was doing was trying to make Gary Jr. feel better. I wasn't thinking ahead, a year and a half, 2 years, thinking that I would have to account for having used the makeup on him, because I knew the reason that I'd done it. And more importantly, Gary Jr. knew the reason that I'd done it. But if I don't even know if I would have done it if I hadn't already been in the bathroom.
Were you covering up marks that were evidence of child abuse?
No. Well, first of all, I didn't even consider it child abuse. That it never even occurred to me that anyone would consider it child abuse. I've been slapped coming up. That's why I believe that it's humiliating, because I have experienced it. So it's not something that I would choose to use for discipline, but I know that lots of parents do. And CPS, who's charged with determining whether a child has been abused or neglected, gives those parents parenting classes.
You knew that your son was disciplining his boys, though, right?
Yes.
Did you ever?
Not physically, though. I knew that he was disciplining them because of what I described before. He'd have them in their room, he'd keep them from doing things with our family. Even on special occasions, things that were really big. No, Gary Jr.'s on punishment, or no, Russell's on punishment. So it would affect everyone that both of them or neither of them could be with us. He would take their toys, their games, their iPads. I saw this, but it was never physical.
Some years have passed now, and the boys were removed from your son's custody. In hindsight, do you have a concern that you may have missed something?
Well, I pray I have. There's always a possibility that I did, but I feel very strongly that I didn't. And the reason I feel very strongly about it is because I think I would have seen something if it was to be seen, if it was there. I saw them often. I talked to them. They talked to me. We spent time alone and with other family members. No one else ever saw anything. The people who see them regularly, none of them saw anything. Corey's own family would spend time with them. They never saw anything. Well, I'm assuming that they didn't, because they never said anything. So I'm confident that I didn't miss anything, but there's a possibility, and I've thought about it over and over. I was running for judge at the time, so I wasn't as focused as I possibly could have been. But I don't believe that I did. I don't believe that I missed it. I believe that the handprint was an isolated incident, and certainly something happened on June 24th, 2018. There's no doubt about that. And I believe also that something happened on June 22nd. But I believe those things because I saw the photographs.
Judge Green, was that the only time that you ever applied makeup to Gary Jr.?
Yes.
One time.
One time.
Did you ever apply makeup to Russell's body?
Never.
Did you ever see a mark on Russell?
Not one that was caused by discipline by anybody. I'm sure I've seen marks on both of them. I mean, they roughhouse, they go in the yard, they're kids. I'm sure I've seen marks, but never any that were attributed to discipline.
Brian, I'm getting ready to switch over to a new topic now, and I was wondering if we could have just a short restroom break at this point.
Certainly. We can do that. Any comment from disciplinary council?
No.
We will take a 10-minute break right now and come back. And Judge Green, of course, you are still under oath, so we will come back and continue your direct examination.
Thank you.